Okay, welcome everyone. Today's the last indexing transformation seminar of the semester, and we have a particular privilege today to host the launching of a book of a dear former colleague of ours, a colleague who remains dear, of course, and whose creative spirit and anthropological energy still permeates through this department sort of 5 years after his departure. So it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Thomas Cousins. He's the Clarendon Lineheart Associate Professor of Social Anthropology at Oxford University and a tutorial fellow at St. Hugh's College. He's been there since 2018. Prior to that, he worked in this department 2013 to 2017. In his 5 years here, he really built various aspects of the intellectual life of this department, including making a very significant contribution in medical anthropology and to the more general theoretical direction of the department. His PhD, of course, is from Johns Hopkins, where he worked with Pamela Reynolds, Jane Geyer, and other leading anthropologists, Bina Das, I think, among others. His work is really situated at the intersection of health, gender, labor, and semiotics. He's published especially widely in the last 5 years in medical anthropology. But this book really brings together an engagement with all of those fields in Southern Africa from the sort of vantage points of an ethnography in Northern KwaZulu-Natal. And we're really excited to hear a bit more about it and to read the book. The format today is that Thomas will speak for 10 to 15 minutes, show a little video, and then we have the privilege of having two discussants. First, our postdoc, Matthew Wingfield, will pose some questions to Thomas. He'll answer, and then Shai Taub, who's a senior lecturer in the department, will offer some more engagements, and hopefully that will open up the book to those of you who, of course, haven't read it yet, although Thomas does have a few copies for sale here. So that's the format. So there will be a chance for people to ask questions from the floor. So without more ado, Thomas.
Thank you. Thank you. Bernard, must I speak into this thing?
As long as it's kind of close, it's next to your computer, it's fine.
Is that fine?
Yes.
Gosh, well, thank you very, very much, Bernard, for that very generous introduction, and a huge thank you to all of you for coming today in this very stormy day. This has been a book that has been many, many years in the making. It's originated in my PhD dissertation, which I completed in 2012, and it's taken a few years to reflect on it, cogitate, regurgitate, and finally give it to you all. I want to firstly acknowledge the people who are at the center of this book, which is a group of about 14 women that I worked with very closely over the course of a year and a half, in 2008, 9, 10. So there's a larger group of people in KwaZulu-Natal who I also owe a huge debt to. But I also wanted to call out particularly my teachers in this room, Patty Henderson, Fiona Ross, and I'll include Cheryl Walker, even though you weren't formally a teacher of mine, but your work really precedes this in terms of your work in KwaZulu-Natal. So I just want to acknowledge all of you and your contributions, and then particularly Jeanette Clark, who's sitting here, who introduced me to the timber plantations in 2008. So thank you very much to all of you. And then I want to acknowledge my research assistant, Dumo Panazi, who is now in Durban at the moment, by far the most extraordinary research assistant anyone could ask for, and she resisted being acknowledged as anything more than a research assistant, and against my wishes to acknowledge her more fully. She's a very wonderful researcher in her own right. And also thanks very much to Fordham University Press, who published this, and the editors there, Brigu Singh, Clara Hahn, and Tom Lane. So thanks to them. And then very much thank you, Bernard, for inviting me, and Shahid and Matthew for agreeing to put on the show. So thanks very much. I actually thought what I would do is start off with a 3-minute video just to keep things a little bit sparkling. It's a little bit experimental, a little bit rough. I made it about a year ago. In my department at Oxford, there was a workshop for people who wanted to learn how to make videos for their research, and I volunteered, and out came this video. So it's a bit experimental, but I think it might give you an introduction to the place and some visuals and some of the crazy ideas which I want to tell you about in a moment. So Matthew's a whiz kid on the IT here.
You see it? No.
Just in time for the movie.
In KwaZulu-Natal, labourers work long hours in the timber plantations, amongst the tall swaying lines of eucalypts, on land that once used to be theirs. From 2008, they received cooked meals through a nutrition program to bolster falling productivity and profits. Are timber plantation labourers in South Africa simply alienated zombie labour, waiting to be replaced by machines? Are their bodies just human motors that process calories in and labour out? Are they an oppressed rural proletariat, utterly alienated victims of a capital, for whom the freedoms and rights won in 1994 are empty promises that have done nothing to improve their working and living conditions? Or are they bootstrapping liberal individual heroes who are authors of their own fate, overcoming excruciating exploitation and immiseration, celebrating the post-racial rainbow nation of modern democratic South Africa? They are neither. Those workers sell their labor power, but they also cultivate the capacity to act. Amandla is the condensed sign of a capacity that is not labor power, but is caught up within capital, and is a critique of capital. Power to the people, the strength to labor, the capacity to forge another world, to care, to make otherwise. The work of repair is the effort to augment one's capacity, amandla, in a way that draws on, acknowledges, and reimagines the wounds of history, and keeps open the possibility of a future through and with others. It is a capacity to navigate the territory of the plantations. It is the capacity of the body to labor. It is the action of medicines on the self. It is the action of the game of marriage, umshada wukudlala, which bends the meaning of kinship, care, and sexuality, even while hiding in plain sight. What will become of capacity, of amandla, in the time of COVID-19? Reparation, recirculation, repair. How do we begin to augment each other? This is the work of repair.
It's on YouTube, right?
So
That's on YouTube as well, right?
it's on the department's YouTube site, yeah.
We can
Thanks.
send that link out.
Thanks, Matthew. So let me proceed in the interest of time while
Go
you
ahead.
fiddle. So you have a sense of the plantations a little bit, and the people I was working with, and the argument I'm trying to make about repair and amandla. So fundamentally, this is a work of ethnography, in that it's a description of a system of labor in KwaZulu-Natal in the timber plantations. It's a description of a history of timber, of conquest of territory, thanks, of a history of racial capital and of how life is lived around the plantation, how sense is made. I focused on the lives of 14 women, like I mentioned, and how they make sense of these conditions, which, as Marx put it, are not of their own choosing, but in which they're forging a capacity to act. The project began in 2008 with the question of why Mondi, one of the large paper companies, it's a global paper and pulp corporation, why they began rolling out a nutrition intervention in 2008 to 10,000 laborers at a cost of 50 million rand a year at that time. And I was interested in what concept of strength and labor power that they were working with in order to bolster their falling profits. And remember that this was a time of intense controversy around HIV and access to treatment and the question of nutrition. So in those couple of years, well, from 2005 to 2008, as you remember, there was intense fights for treatment access. The former president, Thabo Mbeki, denied that HIV causes AIDS, and the question of what the state would do in response to that. So quack cures, there were civil society activism, all centered on this question of HIV access, treatment access and nutrition. So that's the kind of broad empirical background. Anthropologically, this book is an argument about how to think with people who work in the timber plantations, to think about how they experience and make sense of what it means to endure this very heavy system of labor, and how they subtend the meanings of work and labor itself, how they mitigate illness and disease, and how they think about strength and capacity. So it's a book about labor and work, about health and disease, work not only for a wage, but also the work of what it means to act, right? To build a life in a world of meaning with others in the context of a terrible history of colonial violence, of capitalist extraction, and of epidemic disease. So at the center of it is this question of labor power. What do we mean by labor and what do we mean by power? Not only a bodily capacity to labor, but this capacity to build out ethical and political horizons beyond the numbing conditions of labor in this one particular corner of the post-colony. So I'm thinking labor and power in relation to amandla, which you all know from the South African political history, right? Amandla! Yeah. So, what is amandla? And I'm suggesting that we think about amandla as a key term in everyday life, in ordinary language, right? That concerns power, strength, capacity in all domains of life. So this concern with capacity, about what augments it, what depletes it, who is responsible, who is implicated in it. Thank you. Oh, Alistair, yeah, there you go, he's muted himself, thank you. This question of a concern with amandla, about how to augment it, that's what I'm calling ethical substance after Foucault. It is the central concern of life, to build up one's capacities, okay, to undertake ordinary action, to care for oneself and for others, and to repair the wounds inflicted by structural violence, by a history of conquest, by a history of disease, the fragmentation of local worlds wrought by a long history of violence. So, this central phrase is what I'm working with, the work of repair, this effort to constitute this thing called amandla. Please, yeah. So, I thought what I would do in the interest of time is just to give you a very quick sense of the chapters and the chapter outline. I'm sure we can increase our capacity in this door to be closed. No, come in. Fine, yeah. Okay, so there are 5 chapters. Chapter 1 is a description of the working day and the nutrition intervention and the system of labor as it existed in 2008. It has radically transformed, by the way, in the years since that. Huge numbers of people have been made redundant through the use of machines. Chapter 2 is a history of timber and a history of this region. history of colonial conquest, a history of how the sector managed to secure a labor stream, a stream of labor at a particular rate, and drawing largely on Jeanette's work, the history of the timber sector. So the question is, why was it necessary in 2008 to roll out a nutrition intervention? What was happening? What had brought the timber sector to that point? And in short, it involves a post-1994 compact between large capital, in this case Mondi and Sappi and others, and the government, about who should provide all the resources of social reproduction. And the large companies said, well, that's the state's responsibility. And so plantation laborers were moved out of the plantation, out of worker villages, back into their own homes, and in a sense abandoned. So it's this history of contractorization that I'm trying to summarize and bring us up to the point of understanding why this nutrition intervention in 2008. And to summarize chapter 1 and 2, what you need to know is that in order for this plantation system to work, what is required are a whole set of fine-grained, delicate relationships between people, mothers and daughters and neighbors and kin and chiefs and subjects. All of those are in fact required by global capital in order to produce paper and pulp at this rate of profit. Okay. So one of the sets of relationships that seem to enliven this profit machine is what women in the plantation called umshado wokudlala, the game of marriage. And it's a undercover, invisible, camouflaged game in which women draw on all of the tropes and symbols and signs and materials of Zulu customary marriage in enacting a kind of form of mutual aid and intimacy and forms of dependence between women in the plantations. So, so chapter 3 describes umshado wokudlala, trying to make sense of that and what might be at stake in the so-called game. The 4th chapter focuses on these very controversial medicinal substances, which you saw an image of earlier. I should say that this is not ubejane and other medicines that claim to cure HIV. What I was interested in is a set of substances that in fact long predate HIV, been around for at least 100 years in ordinary life, generally known as izifozonke. And they're incredibly hybridized, industrial circulations through urban and rural lives. And they have a counterpart in what are known as immune boosters. So the difference is that immune boosters draw on what biomedicine would recognize as vitamins and supplements. And these became incredibly popular during the 2000s in the midst of this controversy around HIV and nutrition. Whereas izifozonke have powerful emetic and purgative properties. And so really center action on the gut and a whole set of ideas about strength and capacity that emanate from or work through the central node in the body, in which all kinds of social, cosmological, intimate relationships are worked through. So that's chapter 4. And then chapter 5 is a description of 4 different ways of perceiving this terrain, the milieu, the territory, and what might be at stake in those representations. So we have the huge Isimangaliso wetlands and its conservation project, of which Cheryl was very much involved in helping to set up the post-1994 land claim settlements, and the agreements around who constituted a legitimate claimant on that land. So that's one set of cartographic representations. The next is the Africa Center for Health and Population Studies. This is a large global demographic research organization which generate these amazing maps of hotspots of HIV across this landscape. The third is timber plantation systems itself and how they map out compartments of several hectares and plant these very, very straight lines of trees for maximum profitability. And then the last form of representation that I discussed in this chapter is that of 2 small children, one of whom draws in her notebook kind of an alternative rendering of KwaZulu-Natal and her home in this larger world. And the other of which is in the mud on the ground, 2 small boys making little homes in the mud, pinching the mud into walls and using repurposed medicine boxes for cars, etc., etc. So I'm trying to think through all these different kinds of ways of plotting relationships and oneself in the world. And they're not merely cartographic, but cartography certainly has a responsibility here in this story. But what's at stake and how in these systems of emplacement, what concept of the social works in these different contexts. So the South African government very much depends on the concept of society and plotting where everybody lives and who is sick and who's dying in order to provide just the right amount of welfare and treatment, etc. HIV surveillance, in order to generate hotspot maps, has to know where people live according to a concept of isigodi, a local ward. So all of these forms of emplotment and emplacement, I'm thinking through the concept of topology, because topology, borrowed from mathematics, allows us to perceive an established set of coordinates of relationships between elements, which may twist and deform and yet stay constant. Okay, so I'm trying to understand what concept of the social should we be thinking of in a world in which now there is almost universal access to HIV treatment. Now we live in the post-COVID-19 moment, so that's another whole question. But there's a real question now about the South African government's capacity to provide antiretroviral treatments to all those people who need it. So what kind of biopolitical social is this? And my argument in this chapter is that for people who live in and around the plantations, they have to navigate these 3 or 4 very different topologies, different versions of the social. And so what's at stake is the capacity to navigate those topologies. Slightly complex argument, but it's that capacity. So again, all of these chapters stitch together to make an argument about how one thinks with capacity. And I'm drawing on a concept from this place called amandla. Okay. How am I doing for time, by the way?
5 minutes.
5 minutes. So I thought I would just read the final paragraph of the book, because now you have a sense of the argument, and the book says it better than me. Okay. So the argument I've offered concerning amandla, this is page 193 for those of you who want to read along. The argument I've offered concerning amandla and the work of repair has centered a constitutive and historically contingent vulnerability. That's part of my argument, that what's at stake is that we remain vulnerable to each other. It's not quite your conventional concept of power as domination over, but rather vulnerability to another. A vulnerability that must be modulated, mediated, and augmented. The dangers attendant on such an ethical vulnerability require further careful elaboration, not least because of the analytical pitfalls of fetishizing the words and worlds of those on the sharp end of the violence of abstraction. Through each of the ethnographic scenes in the text, I've sought to show something of the difficult relation between word and world. So the argument has made 5 interventions. First has been a refusal to accede to the standard dichotomy between West and Indigenous, this binary that all too often implicitly pervades scholarship of Southern Africa. Second, the text ethnographic descriptions are put to work not to describe others' ways of being, but at least in part to ask about anthropology's own certainty about its concepts. What, for instance, is family in the long shadow of labor migration, HIV, and changing patterns of marriage? How might we understand a game, quote-unquote game, played with deep seriousness in which women marry women in ceremonies attended by the trappings of customary marriage, generating deeply meaningful relations that are not fully socially sanctioned and are always almost deniable? What definitions of gender, sexual identity, relation, power, or playfulness, or meaning result from such games? What does that tell us about our anthropological concepts of affinity or social reproduction, or about standard categories of gendered identity? Third, tracing the layers of concatenating topologies enables descriptions of flows of power, life, disease, medicines, and relationships that distribute health unevenly across people and landscapes. Fourth, I've asked about the formation of the social itself and the possibilities this may afford for an otherwise. Departing from some romantic treatments of such an appeal to the otherwise, I'm less certain about such possibilities. Finally, these arguments turn back to the question of the concept, the relation of concept to world, showing how language is generated from the world. What I've offered here is a reflection both on the specifics of a Southern African context and on how we might think about, and by extension, how we might think about it, the Southern African context, and about thinking itself, in particular the relation of concepts to world. Alongside a description of place and time configured by distressing histories of violence, what has emerged as a troubled reflection on anthropological certitudes, thereby opening, among other things, a conversation about what terms are conducive to a fuller understanding of forms of life and of the living, as well as forms of death and dying. Between living and dying remains the challenge posed by repair. Finally, in speaking about the repair, Kader Attia, so I wanted to tell you about Kader Attia, who's an Algerian French artist. He grounds the notion of repair in a genealogy of the term reappropriation, or rather resituation of things as well as words, of both material and immaterial signs. More specifically, he locates reappropriation in the thoughts of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, his famous phrase, property is theft, Oswald de Andrade, who wrote famously about the Tupi people, Tupi or not Tupi, that's the question, and Frantz Fanon, who thinks about reparation and restitution of what people have been dispossessed of. While the term arose, reparation, while the term arose within European anarchism during the Industrial Revolution and developed within different colonial contexts, Attia suggests that reappropriation, quote, governs all relations between modernity and tradition. It sheds light on the parallel relationship between power and modernity, and more precisely, colonization and modernity. So, reappropriation, recirculation, repair. The question that emerges from this account of life in and around the timber plantations is how then to work with Amandla, not only as immanent critique, but also as a modality of action that orients and is oriented by repair, an augmenting capacity, a pedagogy of healing, and a reparative politics. So, thank you very much.
So I invite our first discussant, Matthew, to pose some questions to Thomas.
Long questions. Thank you very much, Thomas. I think from that little excerpt that you read, I think everyone can see how well you've brought together quite disparate kind of themes and ideas, and you've linked them. So the conclusion is absolutely fantastic and something that I found myself rereading. Right, and at points the chapters were very, useful, and I enjoyed reading them. But the conclusion I reread, which was very interesting. But as Bernard said, I was once a student of Thomas's back in the day, and that just shows how long I've been in the department. But rather how influential you've been for this department. There's a lot of students that most of you won't know, but that were part of my cohort that said Thomas was the reason that they did anthropology. So yeah, thank you. And also thank you, as Bernard said, for continually giving back to the department. So it's, of course, a very dense text, which I think some would, most would argue. But I think what that asks for then is a careful consideration of how we engage a text and how we unpack it and how we read it. I read it over 3-4 days, and Shahid and I read it over 3 or 4 days. And I think it asks for a bit more of a longer engagement, right? And some of those themes that you're picking out in the conclusion, show that. But it also, the book makes a significant contribution to the theorization of the range of themes in South Africa, from labor regimes and work, to spatialized histories, to contestations, to kinship, citizenship, hunger, and ethics. Anyway, what I'm going to do is I've got a couple quotes to preface the questions I do have, so that we can all have a shared conversation. You can latch onto those quotes when if you want to ask questions. So on page 7, you argue that what I offer is a sociography of Amandla, a capacity that is not Marx's capacity to labor or Arendt's capacity to act, but that capacity to engage in the work of repair, to absorb and recirculate that wounding openness to others, including the vulnerability to alienation and the failures of action. Late on 17, you further elaborate on this by arguing the people who work in the timber plantations must contend with a range of forces that splinter their efforts to remain human, the fragmentation of spaces of habitation, the extraction of every ounce of labor power from the body, the wasting of the body by disease, and combined effects of many decades of impoverishment and the erosion of trust, intimacy, and familiar modes of obligation and reciprocity. Further, as you say on 23, it's a form of shared vulnerability. While you do show in the ways in which workers in and on the timber plantations, and that distinction you can, I guess, speak to, engage in the game of marriage, are there other modes or instances where amandla, or the act of repair, takes place between workers, perhaps while in that space? Perhaps this could be during the process of labor as well as this inter-laborer connection. I have two more. Ready?
Yeah.
Okay, you provide a historical location of the labor conditions of the plantations and the crisis in work, which you speak to, with increased absenteeism, accidents, and incidents, right? Which is partially addressed through the nutrition program, which you spoke about, to ensure and ensure maximum productivity. You work through a careful retheorization of biopolitics that moves away from the structured binary of the state, making live and letting die, or letting live and making die. I'm sure most of us are familiar with that. This, you argue, reformulates the way the state must or can be related to or seen. You raise, maybe you want to put this slide up. You raise more widespread, the widespread grant system in South Africa, right? And juxtapose this with the unstable and unfair forms of remuneration for workers in these sites, which we see over many other sites as well. So you further argue in chapter 5, with a state premised on labor regime that underwrites social protection, that there is no social in the classical sociological, that is Euro-American sense. His question is thus, and I think this is Ferguson, right? What comes after the South African social? And this is in terms of the universal basic income grant. So while I know that you speak to how this relates to the role of and the relation to the state, perhaps you could further unpack how you locate this work of amandla or repair in a moment like that. What is its life form away from this type of work? Right? Okay, two more. The particularity of the site, the timber plantation, is of interest, right? While you note its connections and antagonisms with other forms of industrialized labor, such as agriculture and mining, one element of this speaks to the biopolitical processes in these spaces, in the gear worn by certain laborers in these spaces, right? So as you quote on 41, people are given a hard hat, goggles, elbow-length gloves, safety boots, breathing apparatus, reflective vest, and plastic apron must be worn at all times when working in herbicides, pesticides, and insecticides. For a debrancher, debarker, or denotcher, working in harvesting, prolonged standing, use of both arms, eye-hand coordination, communication, near vision, far vision, and repetitive back movements all scored maximum frequency of 6 in this metric. So what insights does this give us into the role of the form of work in this site as compared to others? What does this particularity of protection tell us about the labor plantations, timber labor plantations, in comparison to these other sites of industrial labor? And then a more personal ethnographic question, methodological. The final question is more focused on the personal history, which we weave very beautifully through the text, as the role of ethnographer, which you're engaging. But you note the moment where you realize that as a white researcher in this space, that a distant family member has also engaged the site. And this was C.C. Henkel, I believe.
John Spurgeon.
J.S. Henkel, yeah. Who was a cartographer of the Franciscan territories, or was it another?
So C.C. Henkel was the cartographer in the Transkei, and J.S. Henkel was in the plantations.
Okay, that's right. Okay. So on a personal and academic basis, then how one reckons with these histories, and you do unpack it a bit, but the questions around being in the space as an outsider, and you note about this moment of shame when you say shame to someone, and you go through that. How have you navigated this, or what ideas do you have, you draw from this personalized reckoning? Thank you.
Go ahead. Yeah, thanks, Matthew. Great questions. Thank you. And I'll leave the difficult ones for last, I think. You suggested I might mention this this distinction between in the plantation and on the plantation. And you may know this, but in the last 5 or so years, this concept of the plantation has suddenly exploded in the humanities and social sciences. And it really comes from the US as part of an American reckoning with its history of slavery. And I'm very grateful for that. At the same time, we have to acknowledge that the plantation as a system of labor is in fact global. It's not only in the US and its colonies, as it were, that enslaved plantation that we find the plantation. My friend Man Barua has a book coming out right now on plantations in India. So what is specific about the South African timber plantations? And we also have sugarcane and tea and other kinds of plantations in South Africa. But it encodes a slightly different and distinct set of histories of labor. And I was just struck by the languages that we use to talk about the plantation. So in the US discussion about the history of slavery in the plantations, we know the grammar of on the plantation or off the plantation, which encodes a whole set of violent histories about who was free to move and who was not free to move. In the timber plantations in KwaZulu-Natal, I heard a language of talking about in the plantation and outside the plantation. So there's a different geography, a different topology for that matter. So and in those differences are encoded these very specific political, legal, economic histories of who is laboring for whom with what rights. So in all these contexts, whether it's South Asia or North America or Southern Africa, or in fact, we can think about the rubber plantations of the Congo, there are very specific questions about what it means to be human that each of these historical contexts have thrown up. And I'm drawing on the thinking of Achille Mbembe and others who have really focused this question about how to think about plantations. I'm amplifying the plantation aspect, and what Mbembe would call black reason, which is to say that in the history of, say, European philosophy, there is no escaping its incorporations, its abstractions, its violences that it extracts from black people from around the world. Okay, so that's partly what's at stake in that distinction between in and on, off, and on the plantation. So your question about the social, yes. So in that chapter 5, I'm responding partly to James Ferguson's suggestion that thinking from a place like South Africa, you probably all know James Ferguson's arguments for a universal basic income, suggesting that we should accept that there is no future in which work will become universally available. That's just not on the cards. So we should rather think in very different terms about the claims that citizens, or each of us, might make, whether we're citizens or not citizens. That's an interesting question. What claims we can make on the common weal. So, Matthew, as I understand your question, how does one think about Amandla in other contexts outside of this situation of timber plantation labor? Well, I suppose one would have to proceed carefully, and my first step would be towards other industrial labor systems in South Africa where questions of bodily capacity are critically at stake, whether it's the mines, the gold mines, platinum mines, or let's say agriculture. But beyond that, we know we have a generalized crisis of a lack of work. So I'm thinking about the work of Hannah Dawson and the various of our friends who've been thinking about unemployment and how one becomes a person, a man or a woman, etc., in context where work is not available as a means by which one joins the common weal. I'm hesitant to use the word society there because that's exactly what's in question. And the COVID-19 pandemic really put that firmly on the table. We cannot imagine that now work is going to magically appear and rescue us. So I suppose that connects with your third question about clothing and protection and how to think between the specificity of the timber plantations and other contexts in which heavy protective gear is required. So, I mean, I guess I find it hard to think that outside of the context of capitalist extraction. It's this demand for labor power that requires bodies to be put in the way of injury. And in a sense, this is Jasper Puar's argument, which I addressed briefly in the introduction, what she calls the right to maim. So she builds off of Foucault's thinking to suggest that liberal governmentality requires liberal subjects to be available for maiming, to be injured in just such a way, right? So, so she's drawing on the wonderful historian Julie Livingston's work on disability and debility, making the distinction that debilitation is what happens as one's body is injured in the course of life, but disability is when the biopolitical state recognizes that injury and makes available a set of compensations on the basis of a certain kind of membership of that polity. And so Puar's argument that all liberal governmentality rests on this its ability, its capacity to maim certain bodies and not others. So in a way, I suppose, yes, you could read clothing and protective gear as a way to understand the intersection between this liberal forms of governmentality in which some subjects should be available to be maimed and its intersection with capitalist forms of extraction. I imagine we can think now, in fact, in West Africa, the demand for rare earth minerals for electric vehicles, cobalt, etc. You can bet your bottom dollar that those workers don't have any protective gear. So there's no liberal concern, compassion there. And yet we all want electric vehicles. And then finally, your point about my personal history and ancestors and how one reckons with that. I think that's a sort of open-ended, unfinished question. I feel acutely aware of my standing here and appearing to you as a white middle-class man, and I think the central question for me that I carry out of this is the question of dignity, and how it is that in talking to you about this book and about this labor system and how we might engage each other, that we might acknowledge these terrible histories of indignity and build new capacity to dignify each other in ways that acknowledges these terrible histories of race and violence. Maybe I can stop there for now.
Saeed?
Thank you so much.
Sorry, can I just move this image on because it's quite disturbing.
No,
No,
just want to stop the plan. Just want to stop. Want to stop sharing?
Sure. Why not?
Okay, thanks guys for coming and taking your time. Thank you, Thomas, for the invitation. I echo Matthew, it was a challenging but also very rewarding read. I've known Thomas's work for a while. I was worried it's going to be impenetrable. I think it is not that impenetrable. It's manageable, but maybe I'll share my critique with you. Thomas also knows that I'm known for being difficult, so I will not let you down. Hopefully I won't let you down. So I think that what this book does is kind of, this is what I saw at least, it's a kind of a combination, of trying to bring Marxist, neo-Marxist analysis of economy in South Africa, today with the medical anthropological insights into disease, engaging at the same time with classical colonial anthropological insights around culture and, using it as an archive, but also then weaving this all through linguistic anthropology. And then finally, linguistic anthropology, and then finally the everyday, this whole focus on everyday ethics. So in one level, I immediately think that this is a major contribution to the field in South Africa because of its kind of theoretical ambition, the way it kind of weaves together all these different strands to actually say that, we have to think carefully, and I think Thomas said it so nicely, between world and word. What is this? Word, I take it to mean theory, right? So, but on the other hand, So there's this kind of conglomeration. But if I had to draw it down, I see this as an everyday contribution to a particular kind of post-Marxist framing of the South African present. And here I think Thomas tries to address this tension in a way, right, between writing about people or places in a kind of a classic Marxist mode, which analyzes things to process, almost like about, and then a kind of an everyday ethical or biographical approach, which says we speak with or through, right? And this between about and through, I think, is a central kind of what he's grappling with here. And he does it in a way, he finishes it off through a very Povinellian kind of take, right? Of late liberalism and all these deep kind of terms, which basically, I understand it to be about where we're in a state where certain kinds of liberal recognition coexist and necessarily overlap and probably forever were the kind of histories of despair and a constant kind of deferral, right? So it's this very critical sensibility. I don't know, it's like he's bringing all the stuff together. But I'm just wondering, in this weaving, to use his language, in this weaving and in these threads and the way things get knotted together, maybe at some point, some parts of the book get tangled up. Right? There's a tangle and I'm just like, okay, now what do I do with this? Okay. So let me, hopefully I didn't take too long. Amandla. So you speak about Amandla augmenting power, right? Giving people the capacity, but in the sense of physical strength, in the sense of the body, as a medical category from Zulu kind of traditional thought or culture, whatever you want to call it, but also as social and political, the way it gets taken up, in your field, but also politically in South Africa. And so in this sense, this is a kind of one way one could see this. You kind of bring it out, is the thinking about histories of capital according to Chakrabarty, which are, global processes, history 1 and then history 2. And Amandla, I understand, is the way of saying, there's something else there, something on the fringes of this, which is not entirely captured, but is in this in between, and that is an incredibly productive move. But my question to you is that, do you not think that maybe the very categorization of Chakrabarty actually doesn't give history 2 ability to actually flourish in itself? And this was a tension I felt throughout the book. We're hearing about people in their lives, and then we hear about under conditions of late liberalism where the plantation is doing this and this, and so then then the agency is gone. So there's this question of, this is my question, that actually maybe there's an opportunity here to disrupt this kind of Marxist categorization. Then you speak, my next point, you speak about work and labor, right? And the tension between a Marxist kind of focus on labor and Arendt, who distinguishes work and labor and action, right? And in a way, but what I got is that when you speak about the work that people do, right, it's laboring. Your conception of working on the plantation as an employee is laboring. It's a Marxist conception of laboring in straight rows, mechanical ways with nothing. And work is this work of repair. Right, when people come together to make something else, and that comes to Arendt's idea of action, this kind of the human. But was there ever a sense, is there ever, when people are working in these spaces, is there never a sense of skill, of technique, of competition in the work itself? Or is this really just a mindless repetition as classic Marxists think? Or a vocation, right? Any meaning actually beyond pure survival. Something, whether it's responsibility, whether it's relation, something like that. Not just survival and endurance. And I'm thinking here particularly about, say, the contractors. These are people that worked, so these are people that worked sometimes for many years and then they left, but they somehow got opportunities to become subcontractors. And so now they're local people from the region who have kind of, got a truck, got some people, and they work for those plantations in this way. And so there it was like, is this really endurance? I mean, this seems to be a different kind of activity. Then the next question is, what is work in Zulu? I'm not expecting to answer all of these, right? I'm just throwing them out. What is work in Zulu, actually? That for me was the most important. The way that Amandla, you link it as a medical, religious, and different kinds of category into this everyday world. But what is work in Zulu? What are the relations between labor, land, objects, and body that we call labor and work? Right, in this Greek tradition, like what is that? And what is that relation? And how does that fold into history? How do people actually, and is there a sense of that? I like how you say that you reject this idea of complete amnesia, and I am absolutely sympathetic because memory cannot be linear, right? So So if people don't know, do we not have to find out? But that would be quite interesting to say, what are these epistemological relations? I don't expect them to be necessarily radically different from anything else, because these are stuff of the human, right? But they could have their own terms that could have come up. Okay, do I have much more time? 2 minutes? 2 minutes, okay. Folds. I was trying to get my head around the folds. It's a language that we use, but I think the way you use folds, so Thomas speaks about how in particular moments, different kind of histories, different kinds of archives get folded together, right? So the history of capital, of colonial, of empire, and of everyday labor, for example, get folded together, or maybe gender relations, all kinds of things get folded together. My question is, what does the epistemology of folds do to the questions of identities and concepts? Where are these things before they're folded? Because I would argue that actually the history of capital and the empire is intimately related. They can never be separated, for example. And that's what many kind of decolonial theorists argue. So what does this actually do, this folding? Folding from where? Plantation is used as a kind of a proto-capital in a lot of the literature. I'm not familiar with all of it, but that's what I understood, right? Early forms, plantation, slavery, America leads proto-capital. But here in these plantations, these emerge after industrialization. These emerge after the mining process. So, yeah, so I just felt that there was some kind of, I know it's a creative move, you're making, but these are thoroughly industrial plantations. So does that necessarily, I don't know, does that do anything to your metaphor? So plantation and labor are the operating terms, right, in this book. Plantation, and then the labor, and then the work of Amandla as the work of augmenting this capacity to make life possible, make action possible, ethics, There's a potential here, but I've already mentioned that we get back into this problem, a Marxist kind of history, where it's an analysis of history without subjectivity. So we have subjects, capital and labor, but not much subjectivity. And I know you do present that to us, but maybe that's something to think about. Is there a way we could write subjectivities within conditions of historical conditions where, I don't know, we maybe disrupt some of these categorizations, these subject categorizations. Okay, 2 more points. Why not? I'm here. It took me a whole week to read. How to make sense. So the main question here, and here I'm going to be more critical. Right? The main question is, how do people endure or make life under conditions of life-draining labor, right? Under conditions of empire and all these things. Now you say that this is an attempt to kind of come out of the liberal kind of approach of pity or something like that, right? But then these terms that this whole work move around often are endurance and repair, right? So there's a, how do people endure? And then one is, how do they endure? The answer is, well, they engage in works of repair, which are multiple. But what does endurance do to questions of flourishing? Very few times you mention flourishing. It actually kind of relates back to my question about skill. Yeah, it relates back to that question, of doing something for a certain kind of value or certain kind of, maybe in itself, for itself in a McIntyrean sense. The other thing I'm trying to understand is, how do you conceptualize ethics? On one level, you speak about capacity to act, reflect, and be, right? And you say Amandla is the augmenting capacity. And that's a very Foucauldian kind of understanding. But in the conclusion specifically, you speak about how, well, CSR, corporate social responsibility, is also about a certain kind of ethics, in the sense of responding to humanitarian crisis. But these are very different senses of ethics, And that, to categorize CSR as ethics then potentially comes back into the liberal idea of, a crisis and pity and, a kind of making sense. This is also this whole book I'm trying to understand. You speak about making sense of things, tracing and stitching. But in making sense, you make sense of something that is not, right? The nature of making sense is something that is not either you, or often in a state of breakdown, right? A state of dissolution after crisis, after trauma. We need to make sense of things. So it still necessarily implies a gaze, right? A gaze onto, outwards, or maybe downwards is a question, right? So this is where I'm wondering, do you actually escape the liberal kind of settlement, the liberal idea of looking at poverty, looking at suffering, and then, redeeming the self through this kind of relation? Does enduring or repair actually get us out of that? Particularly because of this question of, how do we make sense of this? How do people endure? I guess the overarching question I'm wondering is, I don't know what to say, but people clearly endure, right? So who are we to come and make this question of how do they do it, I guess. Very final point. repair. Where are we repairing to? Repair is a movement, right? It's not just a moment, right? It's a movement, but it's usually a movement backwards. Now, of course, you will say, no, it's not to the original state. It's like Thomas uses the metaphor of stitching. So it's like you repair the stitch, but the scars remain. And so it's a sense of an incomplete, but also, you know. But in the context of humans, you know, and history and society, where is this repair going to? And what does it look like? Are all the wretched of the earth all doomed to worlds of repair, or to be in a continuous state of repair? And this is where, yeah, I mean, it's not really, I don't think it's your thing, but I'm just a general thing, you know, because there's a lot of work on this kind of decolonial feminist thing around repair. And I'm wondering that, and the final question, what is the relation? And this is the most important one, sorry. What is the relation between repair, or an ethics of repair, or recognizing that in anthropology, and reparation, right, as a certain kind of return of the gift in your conceptualization of South Africa? And this is something I thought was, in a sense, you know, we speak about plantation and labor as if these are the actors in the space, but they are also landowners, they're also business people, they're also lobbies, right, during apartheid and before. In a sense, they are white people who live, who benefit, who sit with it. So what does repair, what does this question of repair, how does it take us to reparation? What is the relation between them, or should we be going in that direction? Anyway, thank you so much. I think, yeah, I think actually what this all tells us, what I finally realized, is that there's a whole lot of threads, you know, that we can pick up on. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Shahid. A lot of stuff there. Let me just dive into the thing that I must correct you on, which is around, well, these two central concepts of endurance and repair. So I'm drawing on Elizabeth Povinelli's concept of endurance, which is, it's fundamentally a critique of liberal politics. So I don't want you to mistake me. I mean, I know you want to tar me with the brush of being a liberal. I get that. But in fact, so no, there's no gaze on here. There's no sense in which I, the liberal middle-class anthropologist, am now going to gaze upon these poor people. No. What's centrally at stake is to say, anthropologically, what if I stand over here with all of my limitations and think with people in this context as a way to generate a forceful critique of liberal governmentality? Okay? So endurance is a way of diagnosing a liberal form of thought. So for those of you who haven't read Povinelli, and I appreciate that most of you won't have, what Elizabeth Povinelli says about liberal political philosophy is that there is a grammar in which there is if we think in linguistics in terms of tense, what happens now or in the future or in the past, there is a certain kind of tense to liberal government, which says, if you're a liberal subject and you feel yourself to be an individual who is self-possessed of your rights to make a claim on the state, well, then you can enjoy all of the benefits of the liberal state right now. But if you happen to be poor and you don't fully conceive of yourself as a liberal subject, well, don't worry. At some point in the future, you will enjoy those fruits, but not right now. Okay? So it's a critique of liberalism that says, why shouldn't, in fact, everybody enjoy those fruits right now? Okay, so I think you've missed that point. So endurance is about trying to understand the ways in which people who are not included as liberal subjects, and all of the fruit that come with it, how should liberal, because I mean, admit it, you yourself are a liberal subject, right? How are you going to conceive of this form of life, which is not within, not able to access the liberal rights that we imagine the state to guarantee, and yet there is life. Okay, so in a sense, this is the question that the book is trying to pose: that how do we think about life, quote unquote, L-I-F-E, in ways that are not fully circumscribed within the Euro-American philosophical, biomedical, capitalist history of knowledge production, right? So the problem is anthropology can only but drag in through the back door all of its inherited terms. And yet I'm saying, this is why I insist on talking about amandla, not in translation as strength or capacity, to insist that there is this other term. And it's not like it's a cultural other. No, it's very much part of this history of conquest and of colonialism. And it's not some native term, it's already a term on the move amongst people all over the world, in fact. It's not like Zulu people have the only claim to Amandla. No, okay? So repair is about saying, and I'm thinking here with Atiyah specifically, and Atiyah is himself, as I said, drawing on Fanon, Proudhon, etc., saying that, okay, so let me make it very clear. It is this ghastly image that you saw earlier, right? What Atiyah did in this fantastic exhibition in 2012 was to juxtapose photographs of World War I soldiers who had had their faces destroyed by bombs in World War I. Early days of 20th century surgery, and these stitches were kind of stitching together their face, right? And he juxtaposed those photographs with objects from the ethnographic archive in order to make the point that in the West, a Western concept of repair is premised on invisibilizing those scars. And what he calls a non-Occidental image of repair makes those scars visible, never tries to cover them. That's the answer to your question about, well, what's this repair stuff? Repair is about saying, I am wounded and you are wounded. And the only way that we relate is through acknowledging, as Mantia Diawara says, licking each other's wounds. That's how we resituate, reframe these terrible wounds, these colonial wounds. Okay? So I just want to set you right there because I felt like you were not quite grasping that. So the trick around what is my concept of ethics? Well, in the first instance, we have to acknowledge a certain inheritance of a Western philosophical debate around ethics. That's the first move is to smash that down and say there isn't only a Western history of ethics with a capital E. As you know, the debate around how do we get to ordinary ethics, which is to say that it's not just this highfalutin, refined thing that we call philosophy. No, ethics is what we all do. It's a concern with the conduct of conduct itself. Okay? So I am saying, as you've sort of vaguely grasped, that there is a tension here, a contradiction between when a large corporate responsibility program says, oh, we're being ethical. And now some fancy anthropologist comes along and says, oh, but here's ordinary ethics. We're using the same terms, but there's a problem there. I'm suggesting that we have to problematize that. And that's the space in which, how is it this corporation can say, well, we've done a good thing here by handing out these carefully calculated calories. We know that that is not so straightforward. And yet, right, how are we going to, should we say that there is, that this claim to ethics on this corporation's side is bad faith? Maybe we can say that, but it doesn't get us very far, right? So you might sense that where we land up with is this very neat dichotomy between capitalist and Western concepts of, I don't know, the state and ethics and all the rest, versus some native set of concepts. And I'm trying to smash that opposition, to say that these things are mutually constituted. That's why I talk about folded so often. Because it's actually impossible to disentangle a history of, as you said, a history of capitalism and colonialism from this place. These things are deeply entangled. All of us are products of these histories. So the foldedness is an attempt to try and get to grips with that, that entangledness. So if my hair is tangled and my argument is tangled, that's exactly right. And but the image is very powerful because our intestines are folded together, okay? As much as our concepts are folded together. And if the intestines are central to a concept of capacity and amandla and the gut, well, then that's what we have to think with. It's the material, this is the literal material of the words and the concepts that we have to work with. So, I feel like I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
In the midst of that robust engagement, I'm wondering if others who haven't had the privilege of reading the book, or even a couple, I know Fiona has had the privilege of reading it, if they want to ask any questions. Simon Becker, please go ahead. And I'm looking for more hands. And Ben and Nomzamo. So if you don't mind writing the questions down. So Simon, Ben, Nomzamo, and any others as well. Go ahead, Simon.
Thank you, first of all, for what we've heard already. I haven't read the book. I have two questions and then a comment. What I did when I received the invitation from you 3 weeks back was I went and reread a book that I read some time back by Bennett and Kruger, which is the history of forestry in South Africa. And amongst other things, this is going right back to the beginning, and amongst other things, they said one thing which really struck me, and that is that they said forestry in South Africa has to do with exotic trees, that is wattle, pine, and gum. None of those come from South Africa, so to a South African looking back in terms of indigeneity, this is foreign, this is alien, these are alien trees that have been brought in. The first question simply is, did that idea that it is alien influence you in terms of speaking to the Zulu-speaking people, working in a plantation where the trees are alien? Did they know that? Was it an issue? And did it have to do something with the modernity, indigeneity aspect which you just mentioned? The second question comes from both the fact that I was in KwaZulu-Natal until 1996, 7, 8, and the fact that I grew up on a forestry farm. I mean, in the 1990s, even into the early 2000s, there were major conflicts between essentially Inkatha Freedom Party as it is today and ANC-oriented forces on the other, and it's certainly, as far as I know, it covered most, if not most of KwaZulu, as it then was in KwaZulu-Natal, and as a result of that, one had Ingwavuma and so on. I'm moving toward a question of whether this political institutional setup played any role in your analysis, because since 2000, as I understand it, your different municipalities in KwaZulu-Natal have got both elected ward councillors responsible for what is happening. Then you also have the company, you have Sapi or Mondi, and then you have the Inkosi, you have the chief. And it would seem to me institutionally that there are at least 3 important local institutions, the state and the private sector, that differ from one to the other and that have got this history, particularly of what happened in the late 1990s, early 2000s. So to introduce an institutional question, did those local institutions play any role? The particular elected ward councillor, the particular chief, Inkosi, and then the fact that you've got a representative from large companies. That's my second question. The third is a comment. I'm sitting next to Yankee Kaba, so I already told him about my comment. The subtitle to your book is Capacity After Colonialism in the Timber Plantations of South Africa. The white South African government of segregation, even before apartheid, identified white poverty and white poverty in rural areas as being something they had to try and approach and help, aid. And one way to do it was to give white poor people forestry opportunities in state plantations and also in the beginning of private plantations. So there was a white affirmative action role that the forestry sector played as an important dimension. How important, I don't know. This also goes into in the book I mentioned. Since then, as you pointed out, there have been attempts, both by company and by local possibly, but certainly national government, to actually improve the lives of black farm workers in plantations. Dr. Kaba's thesis, I don't know whether you know, is a comparison of affirmative action in ISCOR for whites, particularly white Afrikaners, I believe, and then after that, particularly after privatization in Mital, what's the name? Sorry. ArcelorMittal, and comparing the two. Now, this is using what I would call a telescope approach rather than a microscope approach. If I may say so, I haven't read the book yet. It reminds me of using a microscope rather than a telescope. This is me speaking. Does that idea make sense? The comparison to see how the timber plantations, the timber sector itself, can be seen to be something used for affirmative action reasons for different groupings before and after. Thank you for the input, for the presentation.
Can I get two more? Ben?
Yeah, so I read this book recently, and I felt very challenged by it on several counts. But there are sentences in which there are sometimes 5 or 6 semicolons, and between these semicolons are 5, 6, sometimes 7 aspects of reality which are being brought into relationship with one another in a complicated kind of way. Sometimes the metaphor of folding is used, sometimes the metaphor of entanglement is used. And it's very difficult to kind of comprehend all that. To think, well, do I really understand the nature of this argument? There are references to many academic quotes, many of which I'm fully aware of. But I kind of get a sense of, a bit of a sense of what's going on. So questions arose for me, like there's the politics of land that I'm particularly interested in. You know, what is that politics? Where is it up to? The politics of chieftaincy in the past. What's going on? But what about union politics? What about labor politics? Where the term Mandla is often used as a call to arms. Is there any politics around labor itself? So it left me with questions about, you know, where does this take us politically? And I hear some of the second speaker questions about reparations. Where are we going with this? What if Pavanelli offers a critique of late liberalism, what else is she offering? Where do we go with this politics? And I think in South Africa, you know, we just have to ask these political questions. Everything is political, so I'm wondering where that's going. But in terms of complexity, you know, I think this book is going to be challenging for all of us, for everyone, because it tries to do so much. So reality is very complicated. We, as social scientists, we tend to take one or other bit of social reality and try to make sense of that in as much depth as we can. Or sometimes we try to get a sense of, you know, the extensive, you know, do big surveys, try to get the big picture, the telescope, the microscope. But, you know, it's impossible to do it all. But here's a book which is bringing together so many different parts of this complicated reality and trying to think of the particularities about how they are entangled. And then, of course, it's doing the work of disentangling, laying it out for us. And that's what's, in the end, so revealing. Actually, there's so much going on here. So if I went into Duka and focused on agriculture and land rights, it would be one small slice of a very complicated reality. And then I read Thomas's book, I said, hey, I've got to get and ask about all these other things as well. So why I think it's a challenge is because, you know, we can't know everything. It's impossible. So as social scientists, we are going to fail to give a full account of this reality. And as Beckett says, that the only recourse left to us is to fail, and to fail again, and to fail better. In a sense, that's what this book offers me. That I have failed, and I can really try and fail better. And there are many things which we haven't spoken about. But what I would like to just get your thoughts on is, what about the kind of political aspect of this question? Where are you going?
Gonzalo?
Sorry. I don't know. I don't know if I can call you Thomas now, but anyway. Interesting. You know, I have many questions. My first one is, Where exactly did you do this research? And perhaps that'll, help me unpack the rest of it. And I ask this with a bit of rage, right? And it's perhaps because of my own positionality in this work. So I come from KwaZulu, and I come from majority of my family in KwaZulu works in Mondi. Mondi once sponsored the Stateford, where I learned how to do public speaking. Everyone KwaZulu walks around with a Mondi or a Slappy t-shirt, once in a while. A magnum holo, I don't know what that is in English. Back in the day, the social grants, they would bring a truck, and Sapi would have like a nice banner there. The kids would get fried fish, nani. So part of it is, because of that identity that I carry as someone who is, impacted and whose family continues to work at Mondi, Sapi, and so forth, and Alsaf and whatnot. So I think that's where the rage is coming from. But also partly because there's a question that Shahid asked, and it makes me wonder. And I don't even know if I can articulate this in English, so I'm hoping that other people will help me here. Where is this going? This repair you're talking about, where is it going to? I understand that you're talking about endurance here, and I'm partly also a bit, cautious of this term of endurance, because I mean, and I can go to Colonialism and whatnot, perhaps I'm not familiar with this, but I'm wondering, where are you going with this? Where is this repair going towards, And it brings me to this thing that, someone just asked here, in regards to land in KZN is very contentious. If you do work in KZN, I think it's very important, especially in a case like this, to look at the local politics. You can't ignore the role of Induna, of Inkosi and so forth when you look at work like this, especially considering how these corporations are really heavily linked and embedded in further, oppressing these people. But at the same time, not just oppressing them, but how these very people themselves are working with these entities, right? I mean, if you think of contractors, subcontractors, I don't necessarily think that, these people are that alienated in the Marxiest whatever term. But yeah, I don't see you going into that. And I think it's a bit of a shame, because you can't, for me, as someone who, is from this era, you can't look at this, you can't think of, repair and so forth without looking at how these entities are embedded in this, especially given the local politics of the IUP, of the ANC. I mean, if you look at Mondi in like Richards Bay and so forth, a lot of these people start even taking the local chiefs and so forth and bring them in to work for them. And that also does something very specific for gender. And this is my other question of, like, I don't know, it's personally, what's going on? I really want you to explain that more, please, because it doesn't make any sense to me. And perhaps maybe I haven't read the book, so, my critique is, you can take a little bit of salt there. But what is this game? Like, what does it mean? What does it mean for women? You're talking about women here, but you're not taking us into that, especially when you're giving your presentation, which I think is a shame, because women are very essential to this. I mean, if you stay in KZN, if you stay at KwaZulu every single morning, it's all mama getting up with Ubusha, taking their bags, walking every day, getting onto, the truck that takes them to the plantation where they're doing all this cutting and so forth. So we are the women in this. And where's their central locality? You said you spoke to 14 women. I'd like to hear more about that. Where's the language? There's a question that here's a question that Tayob asked here of the language, right? Of, what does it mean? Like, what is umsebenzi? What is it for you? I don't hear you speaking about that, and I think it's very crucial and important. What is umsebenzi? You talk about uzifo zonke nani. What does it mean? I think it goes beyond just, this biomedical ethics and so forth. I think there's something there that needs to be unpacked as well, because I think if you don't do that, then you run the risk of, I remember during the HIV and AIDS crisis, even during COVID, it was being, propaganda saying people mustn't take it, or people who take it are backwards or whatnot. But there's something about it, because even the leaves from this, when COVID came around and so forth, people were cutting off ihlahla from, ugamtrini and using it. And I think there's something that you need to unpack there. Otherwise, you really run that risk of it seeming as if it's, this backwards. Yeah. But no, thank you for, writing on my people. I can say that for the first time. Thank you for that, Thomas. Yeah, well done. It's double. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, let me start with Zama. Really, thank you so much for your comments. Thank you. It's part of the tension of having a book launch versus a seminar. And so I wasn't treating this as a seminar. And that means that maybe I am not going as much into depth ethnographically on this description that you're, in fact, correct to call for. So I can only say, please read the book. The book, the book is an attempt to take very seriously the lives of women in this area. And I say that very self-conscious of the limitations of the kinds of claims that I can make. And so I addressed that to some extent in the book. I had forgotten that you're from KwaZulu, and so it's just down the road from where I was working. So I was in Fekai, just a bit north of Mtuba, and these areas there. So I visited KwaZulu a number of times, and I had a sense of the politics in KwaZulu. And so if we had time, I could go into more detail on the differences between the politics between Sokulu versus Fekai versus Mtuba versus Sompele. And it's a very important history. So I suppose my quick gloss here is to say that I was really trying to understand the world from the point of view of this group of women. And so everything is refracted from their perspective. So if I do in fact talk about land quite a lot in the book, but I do it from the point of view of this very particular point of view. And the difficulty, and I want to embrace this challenge of standing in a room of sociologists, and including particularly Cheryl, because you had such an important role to play in shaping this land in some ways. No, I think wonderfully. But this is one of the things, I can tell you a small anecdote, which Cheryl and I have spoken about before, which is that people who were included within one of the 14 land claimant groups on the Ismangaliso territory, it's not clear exactly who now is a claimant, because it wasn't then either. But many people now, through the diffusions of marrying in and out and kinship and descendants, etc., in fact, everybody has been affected by this terrible history, and everybody has a claim of some kind. So I'm trying to understand the complexity of that from the point of view of these 14 women. I'm not trying to say that this is true for all women and all people who live in KwaZulu-Natal, but it's a certain perspective. And I'm trying to understand what the world looks like for them in the midst of this very heavy system of labor. So yes, Msebenzi, this is the central question. And so let me say, I'm not trying to characterize what it is like to be a black woman who works in KwaZulu-Natal. That would be a very arrogant claim. And you're right to point to the dangers of that, I think. I'm trying to understand their experiences in the ways that they explained it to me. I forgot to address Shahid's question about flourishing. Something you said, Mzama, reminded me of that, which is that, in a sense, chapters 3, 4, and 5 are absolutely about flourishing. Maybe it's not missing the wood for the trees, because it's all about flourishing. The marriage game is fully about flourishing. Consuming Izifo Zonke is fully about flourishing. Recasting the territory through different forms of cartography is fully about flourishing. Okay, it's about vernacular forms of critique that bracket, and I have to use that heavy-duty language. They bracket these externally imposed languages of the map of HIV, or the map of conservation, or the map of forestry. So I'm trying to pay attention to the ways in which these people are critiquing and rejecting these violent vocabularies and forging another way of being in the world. In that sense, I'm trying to be respectful. Of course, I absolutely run the risk of making arrogant claims, and I acknowledge that, and I own that. But that's part of, I feel like, a necessary risk that I have to run in order to say, no, this part of the world, we have to think from this part of the world. We can't only think from Stellenbosch, or even from Johannesburg or Durban. In fact, KwaZulu would be a great place to think from. And I want to see the anthropology from KwaZulu. Politics. Politics is throughout the book. I'm being very explicit that I'm not a political scientist and I'm not a sociologist and I'm not a historian, but I'm drawing on their work. I'm asking conceptual questions about the nature of politics by presenting ethnographic scenes. That's how anthropologists do it. So by presenting a complex descriptive scene, I'm asking about what politics means. And yes, I did address some of it, but actually I also skirted the formal history of ANC-IFP conflict. In a sense, that's part of my attempt to stay close to the experiences of these 14 women. Of course, people referred to those histories, but they were not the dominant concern for them. So it forms the broader background against which we have to understand why was the Mtuba municipality in receivership 3 times over? Why was the Inkosi, in fact, why did the Inkosi allow HIV surveillance to happen in this area at all? How did the various Izinduna conceive of that? Why was the security contractor, whom I call Luke Mkwanazi, how come he was made an Induna by the Inkosi, even though he had no genealogical claims? Those stories are in the book. So I'm telling a different kind of more fine-grained picture of a story of politics rather than the sociologists, I'm sorry to use that word like that, account, because it is a microscope in a sense. It's a different way to approach the world. What else did I leave unaddressed? And reparations. So I suppose my claim that I'm making, moving from, let's talk about land, let's talk about politics, let's talk about the return of people's possessions. My claim is that if we don't think carefully about what each of those things mean, then we run the risk of reproducing, let's say, for example, reproducing a concept of property, which is fundamentally a Euro-American concept of property. If we imagine that we're simply going to return land to the people who formerly owned it, we have to ask, well, whose concept of land is that? Esteemed Professor Cousins edited with Cheryl Walker a whole book on umhlaba, no? So we have a concept of umhlaba which already exceeds the capacity of the word land, territory, of usufruct, of shared modes of belonging. These are things which are not easily reducible to a cadaster. So my claim is that if we fall back on very impoverished concepts of land or redistribution or reparation, then we absolutely repeat a certain violence. This is what Kada, Atia, and Fanon are trying to get at. Let's avoid that repeat, the compulsion to repeat. Let's think carefully about how we are entangled with each other in ways that don't fall neatly into these old, terrible categories. We cannot afford that. That's my final claim.
Cheryl.
It's a. I was provoked. No, it's around the tension, and so I'm between thinking and acting.
Yeah.
So you're talking of, and absolutely, what you've been laying out and what I'm understanding is incredibly rich and requires immersion and time, etc., etc. And it's important, and it's but at the same time, and you know this, so I'm just your reflections.
Yeah.
In terms of restitution, as complex as it is, the pressures for action, good enough action or bad enough action, is it's overwhelming. And how does one think about that, but also how does one act?
It's a really important point, and I absolutely respect the work that you did as Land Claims Commissioner. But I want to acknowledge that positively, to say that yes, in that moment in history, there was immense pressure to act. And so we have to have compassion for that. And I think personally that the resolution around those land claims was the best you could have possibly done. Anybody could have done, right? And
I'm not just talking.
no, I realize that, but I'm trying to think with the particular, because I think it's the particular that helps us to think the general. So in more conceptual terms, in the domain of politics, of which there is this tension between thinking versus acting, we all know that the great political thinkers are able to slow time down. It's that capacity to slow things down that allows other kinds of possibilities to enter in. When we act quickly, then we reproduce the same categories that we have at our disposal. So if I draw from anthropology's theory of the gift, the whole theory of the gift is to suggest that if I delay the moment of reciprocation, the social enters in new ways. And in a sense, that is our great challenge. So yes, we all faced, South Africa faced the pressure to fix the wounds of history immediately after 1994, and we rushed about that business. I don't think that we can do that quickly. I don't know what the answer is. But in a sense, what we have is time. What we need to generate, is time. And in the meantime, and so this is the immediate critique, people are dying. So how should we respond to that pressure? That and it's Povinelli's critique of liberalism, which is that if we don't act now, liberalism's philosophy will say, oh, some people will die, but that's okay, we'll get there eventually. So that's the tension. We have to act now, but what will we do? And I don't know.
But do the women not push you towards that? I don't know. I mean, I'm really speaking from my own experience in regards to land in especially these areas, right? Are the women not saying that they want their land? It's the whole thing for the women when they work. Yeah. So I mean, I'm really wondering, are the women not really giving us that answer? And perhaps that the messiness of, this time, who is the time for? Is it for the men and their politics, and the money and so forth? Because that's a really big part of what's happening with land, especially in these areas. Yeah. But I mean, what is it for the women? Is it the women working this land who want or need this more time? Or is it on the other end?
No, you're absolutely right. So if we think of, yes, the old, unfortunately, the Western political theoretical distinctions between the public and the private, and between the formal political and the domestic, etc. You're absolutely right. The Izinduna and the Nkosi are thinking about territory in that sort of much more conventional way, and they profit from it. So if we, so the big fight that's happening in northern KwaZulu-Natal right now is around the mining, around Somkele, right? And it's not only Somkele, all up and down, as even Sokulu. Everyone in Sokulu wants that platinum underneath the dunes, right? So, yes, in that version of thinking of society and politics as a domain in which men act with big action, and I'm sort of using those terms as a way to gesture towards a political theoretical problem, then we're doomed. You're absolutely right. And my claim, which is threaded through here, is that, yes, we need to think, the whole point about thinking about the ordinary and thinking about repetition, the repetitive rounds of the day, is that it's not the great telos of, a masculine telos of liberation in the conventional sense in which men get to act as political actors on the stage, right? What I'm trying to get to here is that in the ordinary rounds of everyday life, in and around domestic spaces, time is conceived differently. So in a sense, yes, absolutely, women, and we have to put that, we have to bracket that concept of women here, that's exactly what's at stake here, are very much concerned with how do I secure the means for everyday life and for reproduction? Is that to secure land rights according to constitutional law? Is it to secure recognition in terms of customary law? How will that be performed in some sense, right? The 14 women I worked with, the vast majority of them lived in very, very insecure ways, in insecure places. They lived in a hostel or in an ex-barracks. There were only 3 women who actually were in Umuzi. some kind of household that had a genealogical claim to that place. Everybody else was in a circulation, moving. In fact, if I went back, there are only 2 of those women would I be able to find, because everybody's gone to work in Nelspruit or Eastern Cape. It's so insecure. So these questions, let's call it of land and security, tenure security, absolutely, they're critical. I'm not denying that. But that's not how I'm approaching it, in a slightly different way, to ask a slightly different set of questions. So it's not to arrive at a set of policy prescriptions. I absolutely want to avoid that. But I do want to find some way to capture these fundamental questions, which you're absolutely putting your finger on. Absolutely correct.
Well, it just leaves me to say, firstly, to take inspiration from Ben and to think about the richness of this book, and some of the best anthropology for me is an anthropology that really tries to capture the totality of things, and you've really done that, I think, and you've shown us that you've done that through this conversation. The fact that you've evoked such rich, powerful arguments proves, I think, the importance of your book, and the way that it can be read at multiple levels by people from different disciplines, people reading, people with investments politically, socially, historically in South Africa, and beyond, of course. And so it's really been an honor to have you here, an honor that you've all come. I know that there's people from multiple institutions here across 3 continents, and so thank you very much. And to acknowledge those online as well, thank you for your attention. Thomas does have a few of the books on sale at a reduced price. So please read widely. I'm sure that he'd be very open to your continued conversation and critique. And thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks, Bernard. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you.